Ahead of Attorney General Eric Holder's visit today, he's urging calm and sent a strong message to the people of Ferguson in an op-ed in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, writing, quote, "This is my pledge to the people of Ferguson. Our investigation into this matter will be full. It will be fair, and it will be independent." I want to bring in Paul Henderson, a veteran prosecutor, and Kendall Coffey, a former federal prosecutor and U.S. attorney. Gentlemen, both, thank you so much. And I want to start with you, Kendall. In his visit today, Eric Holder will meet with FBI agents, prosecutors, and community leaders. The Attorney General also held a call with, along with White House Senior Advisor Valerie Jarrett and about 40 national civil rights leaders, one with 1,000 civil rights leaders. How will Holder's visit change, you think, the impact of the investigation?
Well, it's not needed to have the feds working any harder. With 50 FBI agents and several hundred interviews, they're working this day and night. The positive thing it could accomplish is to improve cooperation with state and local. There has not been clear evidence of cooperation. In fact, we've seen symptoms of some disarray and disagreement.
Give me some examples. What do you see?
Well, for example, Holder was very adamant that they shouldn't release the video of the alleged robbery inside the convenience store, that would inflame the community. They did it anyway. And we're also questioning whether or not they are cooperating and consulting into how they're proceeding. You can't tell if they are law enforcement partners or law enforcement competitors with separate agendas. Holder being on the ground, reaching out to state and locals could go a long way toward mending those fences.
And Paul, this federal investigation seems to be going quickly. Here's how the Los Angeles Times writes about it. He says, quote, "Holder appears locked in an odd and unsteady competition with Missouri officials over which one of them, if either, will prosecute Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson first." Could that be the case?
That could be the case. And what I think is interesting, especially here with these facts and circumstances, is that even though we are starting the process today with the grand jury, that is not the final judgment. So double jeopardy and constitutional protections don't necessarily apply, even though we are having this grand jury come together, because it's not an issue where the defendant is ultimately at risk. So he still could be charged. And that actually, I think, is actually more important for the community to understand and to know that there are several pathways that there could be a further indictment or further charging coming out of these facts and circumstances surrounding this event.
Yeah, and the Attorney General has been briefed on the federal autopsy of Michael Brown. It shows Brown was shot 6 times, at least, which appears to verify the private autopsy done by the family. How important, Kendall, is this third autopsy?
Well, I think it's extremely important. You're going to get some differences in the eyewitness account. We're already hearing competing versions of what happened. So if you can,
does that not always happen? I mean, when witnesses see something as traumatic as that?
Especially in cases like this, because it all happens so fast, it's so dramatic, and they're hearing from neighbors, they're seeing on TV all kinds of information, and that filters into the mindset of witnesses. But if you can get a solid core of scientific information, at least establishing some of the basic facts, how many shots, what angles, and ultimately what distance, those could be vitally important elements.
And Paul, I want to continue on the state investigation into this shooting. The grand jury will begin hearing information today, any minute now, from prosecutors to determine if charges should be filed against the officer. According to the Associated Press, the potential charges Officer Darren Wilson could face include first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and involuntary manslaughter. We're told that Officer Wilson will be offered a chance to testify at some point in this process. Walk us through this. What has to happen?
So typically what happens in a grand jury, you're allowed to bring in hearsay evidence. And so what that means is a lot of the reports that we've been hearing in the media from people that have been calling in will be introduced as evidence to this grand jury. So that means that you won't necessarily have witnesses that are going to testify in a trial, if there is a subsequent trial, that are going to be presented as evidence. But one of the things that's interesting about the grand jury process, specifically in Missouri, is that the officer himself is allowed to testify. So I can't imagine at this critical juncture that this officer is not going to take this opportunity to try and influence that grand jury and is going to testify to give his version of what we're hearing. But, you know, one of the things that I think that we're all watching and paying attention to is none of those reports and none of those investigations have been released either to the community or to the media at this time. That's information that's going to be provided specifically and exclusively at this point to the grand jury.
And Paul, is that unusual?
It's not unusual. This is typically what happens. You know, one of the things that I think that's really interesting about this is what happens after that information is given to the grand jury, what it's going to mean if they indict or if they don't indict. We've seen cases in the past where a grand jury has been questioned or challenged when there's been a lot of notoriety around the case. And, you know, one of the rare instances of this was like in the O.J. Simpson trial, where we had the grand jury come back with an indictment, and then the defense attorneys representing Mr. Simpson challenged that indictment and forced prosecutors to indict and charge separately. So I don't know that something like that is going to happen, but what makes all of this very interesting is the fact that there's a federal investigation that's going on concurrently where independent charges could come out of this.
And Kendall, in an interview that will air later today, my colleague Ronan Farrow spoke to the president of the Missouri Fraternal Order of Police, where he talked about whether Wilson could get a fair case. This is what he said.
Do you think that there's been a rush to judgment here?
I think there's definitely been a rush to judgment. I think it was irresponsible to call for vigorous prosecution. We are all for a vigorous investigation, and when we talk about justice, we want justice for all concerned, and I am concerned that Darren Wilson receive his due process.
And Kendall, is this a concern?
I think only in part has there been a rush to judgment. Certainly there are people in the community that think that the officer killed and should go to jail. There are people in the police community that think that the officer is a victim of the media and a lot of politicians. From what I can tell, the media itself has not made a judgment on this, and I can assure your viewers, the Attorney General of the United States and the Department of Justice, they have not made any kind of judgment on this case yet.
Kendall and Paul, thank you so much for being with us. This is a continuing story, and this is just getting more and more intense as we now see the Attorney General arriving to Ferguson. Thank you so much. And coming up...